When you find yourself at the top of a rabbit hole, looking down into the vast, fantastical world below that is Wonderland, what do? You jump. Phoebe in Wonderland is written and directed by Daniel Barnes and premiered at Sundance in 2008. The film stars Elle Fanning as Phoebe in one of her earliest roles, but also has just a star-studded cast all around, despite being an indie film. I believe this film does a pretty brilliant job at exploring mental health and neurodivergence, and how people react to it through the singular case study of Phoebe. The movie does have a bit of a slow pace, and is more of a collection of events that are occurring over Phoebe's life, particularly in her childhood, rather than being a cohesive narrative story. The rest of the video will contain specific spoilers, so if this is something that you're interested in experiencing, I do recommend that you check it out before you continue with this video. I was able to watch it on a streaming service called Plex in Australia, but I do not know where it will be available worldwide. I personally really enjoy this film. I think it is marvelous and would highly recommend watching it. Phoebe in Wonderland is the story of Phoebe Lichten, a young girl who is very obsessed with Alice in Wonderland and is very involved in the performance that she's putting on of Alice in Wonderland at her school. Throughout the story, we see as her rituals evolve into some dangerous territories and the confusion that it brings to her and her family. This is all explored through the lens of Wonderland and Looking-Glass land. But how well does the film really do this? Throughout the film, it becomes fairly obvious that something is going on with Phoebe, and it goes beyond just quirky childhood behaviour. Phoebe has rituals that she does to make sure that things happen. They're repetitive actions, like washing her hands multiple times. Sometimes she does specific steps in specific patterns, and some of them do cause her harm. She also has trouble with impulse control. She also talks to a lot of her Wonderland friends, who are generally representatives of people that Phoebe knows in her real life. For example, her mother is the Red Queen, her father is the Queen of Hearts, her therapist is Humpty Dumpty, and her principal is the Mad Hatter. It's difficult to tell if this is supposed to be a part of Phoebe's imagination, or if it's supposed to be a part of her developing symptoms, as a lot of people see her talking to these Wonderland characters in real life, and it does seem to go beyond just the average quirky childhood behaviour. It's clear that something psychologically is going on with this child, and it is actively distressing her and her family. Phoebe even outright tells these characters that she sees at some point that they are unhelpful, as they can't give her any new information. They are just reciting lines from the book. It's not always helpful for her to be communicating with these characters. Towards the end of the film, Phoebe is diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome, which also includes an obsessive-compulsive component according to the diagnostic criteria of the time. But does this explain how she sees the Wonderland characters so vividly?
It's about children who suddenly seem to get rude around Phoebe's age. They can't control it. Some obsess over ritual.
This is people who curse.
Not only. And her fantasy, Wonderland, that isn't part of it. That's just Phoebe wanting to be someplace else.
Let's put a pin in that. The film is trying to present the Wonderland components as a part of Phoebe's imagination and a way for her to cope and self-regulate as her symptoms of Tourette's start to worsen. So let's look at these Wonderland characters with this intention in mind. Early in the film, Hilary takes her daughters to see the ballet Swan Lake, which absolutely enchants Phoebe. She mentions later, when she sees a ballerina out of costume, that if she had a costume like that ballerina, she would never take it off, because maybe one day she could become the character. Her mother tells her that she would have to choose very carefully, and she takes that to heart. When the new drama teacher puts on a production of Alice in Wonderland, Phoebe sees the perfect opportunity to put on a costume that she would never take off. Prior to this, Phoebe definitely has an interest in Alice, and it's not just her. Her mother is also obsessed with Alice in Wonderland. She's writing a book on Alice in Wonderland. It is called Vicarious Enchantment, Wonderland and Perversion. Hilary even believes that Phoebe's obsession with Wonderland is a way of them connecting, and a way for Phoebe to get her attention specifically. The specific interactions that Phoebe has with Wonderland characters is sometimes positive and sometimes negative. She's seen having fun with the Red Queen, which does somewhat reflect her relationship with her mother and the way that they connect. Humpty Dumpty disappears before he can give Phoebe any real helpful information, which does reflect her relationship with her therapist, because her mother cut off their sessions before he was able to provide Phoebe with anything very helpful. Interestingly, the only Wonderland character that is not representative of a person in Phoebe's real life is Alice herself. Phoebe's situation with her diagnosis must feel like stumbling down a rabbit hole into a whole new nonsensical world that she can't quite make sense of. All of the adults seem to understand how the world works and have this understanding that she doesn't. And she doesn't understand the explanations that they provide to her, much like the characters in Wonderland provide Alice with information and explanations that she doesn't understand. The adults and children around Phoebe can see that she is different. Some of the adults, like her mother or the drama teacher, see her as exceptional, as somebody that is above regular children. Whereas the majority of her peers and teachers see her as different and other her and ostracize her because of her differences. It's no real surprise that Phoebe sees herself in Alice and relates to the character, but it is interesting that she doesn't feel like she is totally Alice. There is a connection, but she is not the embodiment of Alice. It's a character that Phoebe wants to be, but isn't quite there yet. She doesn't fully see herself as Alice, and that's kind of interesting, and definitely something that we could go into more detail about, maybe in a different video. Phoebe in Wonderland has a very interesting use of Alice as source material. It uses the elements in a very overt way, it's not subtle about it, it is very in your face. And the actual book that is being referenced exists in this universe as well, which makes a lot of the references even more overt. There are a lot of interesting analysis that could be pulled from this movie's use of Alice in Wonderland that I am barely covering in this video. However, as much as I enjoy this film, the use of Alice in Wonderland is a bit muddled. Overall, I believe the movie is trying to do just a few too many things and tell too many stories to do any particular one particularly well. The movie is primarily a character study on Phoebe and the journey that she goes through in discovering more about herself and her mental health issues. However, there is also the story of her younger sister Olivia, who I haven't even mentioned yet, but she views herself as a child prodigy and is frustrated that she has to look after her older sister. And there is a lot going on there with Olivia. There's also the story of Hillary, who's Phoebe's mother, who is struggling to raise these two very bright, very individual children basically on her own without much support from her husband, while also trying to live her own life and write a book. And it's clear that Hillary also has some issues with labeling her child as neurodivergent, as having some sort of psychological issue. There is a interesting layer there that the film does spend quite a bit of time on. There's also Phoebe's father, who is struggling to co-parent with Hillary and also has some pretty significant father issues of his own that he's trying to deal with. There's also the story of Phoebe's friend Jamie, who is in the play at school with her, who plays the Queen of Hearts and is a feminine boy who has a lot of issues with bullying and even has a slur thrown at him at one point, and the movie does focus on it, weirdly. And then there's also the story of the drama teacher, who appears to be very largely inspired by the Dead Poets Society character that Robin Williams portrays, and it just seems like the person who was really gunning for that character has watched that film a few too many times. There's just a lot happening in this movie, so much so that it's not really focusing on any one thing or having any one thing shine through particularly well. As well as the overwhelming amount of stories that the movie is trying to tell, it's never really clear what the Alice in Wonderland components of the movie are trying to bring across. It's unclear whether the characters that Phoebe interacts with are just in her imagination or if they're a manifestation of her symptoms. From what is presented towards the end of the film, we are supposed to believe that the visions that Phoebe sees of Wonderland characters are just her imagination and not part of some ongoing psychiatric issue. Although it is important to note that this information that we receive about Phoebe's diagnosis comes from Hilary directly. Phoebe's mother, who we have talked about, has issues with labeling her child with psychiatric diagnoses. We assume that the information that Hilary provides us is the same information that she received from Phoebe's psychiatrist earlier, and is just relaying the information that she was trying to push down and discard earlier. But we only ever hear this from Hilary. We do not hear the psychiatrist's direct diagnosis. It is possible that Hilary, who was already resistant to labeling her child, has hidden part of her diagnosis as a way to allow her to still retain this idea that the Wonderland that Phoebe has created is part of her imagination rather than part of her psychiatric diagnosis. As a way for her to feel more comfortable with labeling her child at all, with the situation overall. While still helping her daughter, she gets to feel more comfortable with it and withhold some of that information. This is just a theory. There's no hard evidence to back it up in the film itself. There's no indication that this is what we were supposed to take away. But I think it's a theory that does hold some weight. To me, these characters don't seem like just imaginary friends. They come in and out with any real control from Phoebe's end, as if they are hallucinations. They generally seem to appear when there's a high stress or high stimulation in a situation occurring, and it's because of these characters that Phoebe decides to jump from the stage balcony, which is one of the inciting incidences of the film. It's one of the climactic incidences of the film. They're also an active distraction while she's trying to explain to her principal what the situation was when she did jump from the balcony and the reasoning why. It's just difficult to believe that these are things that Phoebe is using to cope with her situation and just her imagination, when a lot of the evidence is pointing towards them being a part of a psychiatric condition. It's just her imagination, it's just her being creative. It's all it is, just creativity. And I don't really buy that. After watching this film several times, I'm still not entirely sure what is trying to be said with the inclusion of such vivid Alice in Wonderland characters from Phoebe's perspective. And this is potentially what was intended by the filmmakers, for these things to be unclear in the film as they are unclear in real life. Maybe it's supposed to be a commentary on what we consider to be disordered behavior versus what we consider to be normal behavior. Regardless of what the filmmakers were trying to say, I think it's an interesting topic to discuss, so let me know what you think of Phoebe in Wonderland, and also let me know if there are any other Alice in Wonderland media that you think I should look into. I've been a Vodka Cat. I'll see you at the tea party.